All right, so there's a couple more questions that I think come up in the chat that I think will be covered here in the next little bit. So if not, just hold them, we'll get to them eventually during the day. So next we're gonna have Sean and Jeremy again tag team us on low-tech structures for wet meadow preservation. So take it away, guys.
All right, thanks, Eric, and welcome back, everyone. Jeremy Maestas here with NRCS and Sean Connor with Biologic Inc. And we're going to go through in this presentation an introduction to the various types of structures and all their fancy names, but more importantly, what are they designed to do? And when should you be thinking about using them? So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Just as a reminder for this first part of the presentation, we're going to be thinking about that upper part of the watershed and our meadow systems primarily. We will talk eventually about the perennial systems just briefly at the end. Next. We'll be dipping into Bill Zeedyk's toolbox for riparian resiliency, which most of these techniques are described in his book, Let the Water Do the Work. Really recommend picking up a copy if you can still find one of those available. Great resource with some more detailed information on the types of techniques and how Bill thinks about using them. Next. You'll probably get tired of seeing this diagram, but like we mentioned earlier, we want you to start thinking beyond just the structures and all the details of structures, because the most important part is like what's going on with processes that form healthy and functioning meadows. Geomorphology, hydrology, ecology. How should it be working and what might be impairing it from fully functioning? Next. Since the channel incision problem is a primary impairment that we're going to be addressing with these techniques, way to frame the opportunities out there on the landscape is to think of them in kind of two buckets. And I find it helpful to think about them in terms of like, what is the level of incision that's going on in that system right now? In other words, how deep is that trench and how much effort is it going to take you to get out of that trench and back up onto your meadow floodplain surface? So there's really not a hard and fast rule, but if you're more than a few feet deep in your trench, it's probably going to take you a while unless you have a tremendous sediment supply to get back up on that meadow. It'll probably take you a few interventions. So we really want to be thinking first and foremost about what Bill calls preservation opportunities. Looking at a healthy meadow and finding that one little nick point or that one little spot where if we let it keep going and do the wash, rinse, and repeat method, we will end up going further down this degradation process. And so those preservation opportunities are where we want to start first, and then typically coupled with some restoration further down the channel as it gets deeper and deeper and is going to take more time and interventions to address. Next. Here's just a cool visualization of that same concept. These things can happen in the same work area or project area. This is one out of Wyoming, I believe, where above the head cut is a functioning meadow with sheet flow, green groceries, and our action here is to prevent erosion at the head cut itself. And by doing that, we're actually protecting and preserving several acres of meadow above that. And so we need to learn how to think about that in our restoration planning and how we talk about the outcomes of our efforts. That single action to address that head cuts are the most important thing you could do in that meadow. Below the head cut is really, as you can see, it kind of gets a little deeper. Those are more of your restoration opportunities. And we'll talk about a variety of techniques to address that. Next. Going back to the key processes that prevented incision in the first place, A couple of key ones here in these types of ephemeral and intermittent systems, one being vegetation. You know, when we have wetland and mesic vegetation dominating our meadows, their root density is so much higher than our upland plants, and they really hold that soil together. And so when we disrupt that for a variety of reasons, natural disturbances or some of our actions, human actions, this system can start to erode. And unless you hit a hard point that stops it from moving up valley, it'll probably continue to go every year during your runoff events. The other key process is that hydrology, or that sheet flow we've been mentioning, where water spread out, a lot less stream power, a lot more opportunity to infiltrate and go into the soil. And so those two things are some of the key processes that we're focused on addressing with these techniques. Next. And so Sean's going to present these techniques for preservation and restoration in terms of what they're designed to do, whether that's head cut control, grade control, or restoration of sheet flow. And so with that, go ahead and hit next, and Sean's going to get us going on head cut control techniques first. Sean?
You bet. Thanks. So as Jeremy said, the first step I think that we'd like you to think about is to think about those three approaches. Instead of thinking what structure needs to go here, think about what should the structure do. And so that's where we're going to start with those three. We're going to start with head cut control. That's the first of our approaches for meadow restoration and preservation. So these principles are helpful to think about when we talk about treating head cuts. This idea about lowering the fall's height, the height of the falls. So falling water has a lot of power. It creates a scour in the bottom. And so if you can lower the height of those falls, that's one thing you could do. Or widening the lip, so more dispersed water has less power. Also hardening the base to eliminate scour at the bottom there. And maybe more importantly, and most important maybe, is this idea about soil moisture and the root density right on that lip. And we'll talk quite a bit more about that. Next. So this is a head cut. It's about 8 inches tall. Maybe it's a foot tall. Let's say it's a foot tall head cut. This is some stuff that we normally just walk right by. It's like little tiny stuff. Jim talked about this earlier. Little tiny head cut. It's a foot. If you look in the background there's another one, another foot tall head cut. Just about midway up the valley. And then all the way at the top where the sagebrush starts, there's one more. And so these are little head cuts, but if you combine all together, we've got like 3 feet of elevation drop here with these 3 head cuts in this system. So this is the low-hanging fruit. This is the stuff that we want to treat. It's easy, accessible, quick. Again, look at the vegetation above this head cut. That's some Baltic rush, something like that. The dark green, immediately below the head cut, no more wetland vegetation. All of a sudden, we've got dandelions and bluegrass. And that's just an indicator we've lost that sponge. There's not as much soil moisture right below this head cut. So head cut control is a major approach that we use when we're protecting wet meadow systems. Next. Some of the structures that we use to do head cut control, have some fancy names. This one on the upper left, the Zuni Bowl. This was a concept that Bill discovered on the Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico, and he gave it this name with acknowledgement to them. This is a step falls idea. Again, we talked a little bit earlier about log and fabric. That's one in the middle there. Rock rundowns, rock mulch, rock layback. These are all head cut control structures. Next. So the rundown and the rock mulch, those are ones that we use quite a bit. The rundown is generally a little longer than it is wide. You can see one in an incised cattle trail here. And the rock mulch, these are for off channel mostly type ideas. Next. The rock rundown steps the water down into a channel, the next channel over. You can see this, it's armored up. There used to be an erosive head cut here, and we've just armored it with this rundown to guide the water down into the bottom here without causing more erosion. So we're stopping this head cut with a rundown. Next. Another example of a rundown. This is one little wetter system. There was an erosive channel here with the head cut at the top, and this is a rundown as well. Next. Rock mulch is just what it sounds like. It's a bunch of little rocks all placed together right on the meadow surface. You can see in the upper left-hand corner, that's what it looked like after construction. We had just put it in. And this is a swale channel that was starting to erode here, and small head cuts were starting. You can see in the lower left, that's what it looked like when water was flowing over it. It kind of armored that little head cut area there. And now that water rumbles over that rock and doesn't further incise or head cut even further. And on the right, then you can see that all of the vegetation has grown up through that rock mulch and it's no longer visible. That really solidifies the structure and makes it to where it doesn't go anywhere. All those plants right around the rock mulch are healthy and happy. They have a little bit more soil moisture there because of the mulch. And so this can be a really effective technique for small head cuts in smaller systems with not a lot of flow. Next. The layback is for wide but relatively short head cuts. So you can see this one is a wide, long head cut there, but it's not very tall. So we call that a layback. Basically, you lay the soil back on the head cut and establish these rocks on it. You can see a couple examples here. Next. This is that same one in a before and after shot. You can see the head cut there on the left in a pre-treatment position. Again, not very tall. It was only about 2 feet tall, generally across the whole thing, but it was probably about 30 feet across side to side. And so now look at the vegetation in the treated one on the right, much more robust. All that moisture is being held in that meadow above. It's not seeping out of the head cut. And we've arrested the onward progression up valley of this head cut. So we're preserving what's above this head cut with this feature. Next. Another one real quick made out of native rock. So we use a lot of different materials. The one thing I wanted to note here is that little head cut right above the layback. Head cuts typically travel in 2s or 3s, kind of like a little gang. And we always see the big one at the bottom, but sometimes we fail to see those upper ones just above it. And so we need to be treating those too. So there's a rundown above and a layback in the foreground, both of them being head cut control structures, which are preserving the meadow above. Next. One of our fancier structures called the Zuni Bowls, super fun to build, complex. You can see this beautiful diagram from Watershed Artisans in the lower left. Craig Spawn-Holtz made this beautiful figure that we've referred to a lot, and we'll get to some references at the end of this where you can find these documents. But the Zuni Bowl is a step falls, and so again we're limiting the height of the falls. We're making a pool, and then it has to go over a lower pool pour over. And so it's a step falls with a plunge pool, which takes the energy out of it, but it also prevents the further migration up valley of this head cut. So head cut control again. Next. Another example of a Zuni bowl in the lower left here with a one rock dam right below it. We typically put a one rock dam right below it. And so that that step falls idea. It has to go over the lower pour over, and then it has to go over the lower, that one rock dam at the bottom, which we'll talk about in a minute. Next. Particularly elegant. These can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. This is a Zuni Bowl in Northwest Colorado that was constructed last year. You can see the meadow above, hardly any channel at all. And then this gully starts. So this is the start of the gully. And if we do nothing here, this gully just goes up and around the corner and dewaters the whole system. And so this is a Zuni Bowl that is stopping the onward progression of this head cut and preserving what's above it. Next. So we had a question earlier about log and fabric step balls. And this is one of Bill's structures. He calls it log and fabric because we use geotextile underneath and in between the layers. We use this when we can't really get rock, or we have limited amounts of rock, or we want to treat a head cut that's a little bigger for the rock that we have available. You can see various materials. In lower right is aspen logs that were used. And you're right, whoever asked this question, sometimes it's hard to get wood in sagebrush systems. And so in the lower left, we had a project, we were particularly well funded, and spent some money on some real logs that were really uniform. Next. Here's another example. This is a before and after, of course, what it's looked like before. And then we put in a log and fabric step falls here. Again, a head cut control structure. We're basically sealing up the lip to allow that vegetation at the head cut, at the very edge there to become more vigorous, preserve soil moisture there. Those plants then hold all that soil and keep it in place. And so this head cut here, we did use fence posts again. There's probably $500 worth of materials in this particular structure. So, you know, not cheap. It's an expensive structure, but when you look at what's above it, that meadow right there, super valuable in this particular landscape. And so we're preserving now with this feature, we're preserving everything above it. So below this is a nasty gully. You can see the soil type and the gully forming here. Nothing but sagebrush and gully below this green gem kind of in this sagebrush system. So pretty important head cut control. That's one approach to wet meadow preservation. Next. So again, 3 approaches that Bill advocates for working in wet and mesic meadow systems. The first 2 here, we went over head cut control. Now we're going to talk about grade control. Next. So treating gullies, this idea about reducing the channel slope to reduce the velocity of the water. We do that with grade control structures. Sometimes we want to widen the channel bottom. Jim talked a little bit about good erosion. Sometimes we want to bash some walls and try and get that stream to meander a little bit more. Increasing channel roughness can help. Definitely slows down the water, gives it more time to infiltrate. And retaining soil moisture, again, is always important. So grade control. Next. So our workhorse for grade control in these systems is called the one rock dam. And basically the one rock dam, these are both examples of one rock dams. There are actually many rocks, but they're all one rock high. So we're not stacking rocks on top of each other. Everything is one rock high, and that's an important feature of the one rock dam. In the photo on the right, you can see that the water is being held back by this one rock dam. It's depositing sediment on the uphill side. And then below, you can see what the small channel, it's more of a swale, looks like. But all of the water that's held in this one rock dam on the right is being soaked into, infiltrating the soil on both sides because it's not rushing fast off the landscape. Next. So these one rock dams, they do have some important components, and you can see the diagram in the upper right. So the side view, this idea about the uniform surface is important. That's something we should strive for, a uniform surface. And this picture in the bottom here is particularly elegantly made. You can see the uniform surface for the water to go over. That's important because if we have a bunch of ruggedness on that surface, it channelizes water, and water wants to go fast through the cracks. If we have a big shark tooth poking up, divides the flow, water has more turbulence, and we really want water to just ease up and over this structure and deposit its sediment. If we do that, if we build these correctly with some finesse and try to emulate this uniform surface, then the water eases over, it drops that sediment, plants become established, and the structure becomes really successful. Next. Another example of the sedimentation in behind this structure, you can see it slowing down, dropping its sediment load. That aggrades or brings up the channel bed elevation. So this is a grade control structure. Next. I love this diagram, again, from Craig Sponholtz. This is one that we use all the time to talk about where in a system should a one rock dam go. And these grade control structures really should be placed, between meanders. So we call it the crossover. And you can see in the middle there, the green highlighted area. Those are the crossover. That's the natural area of deposition in a stream system. So it goes through the pool, coming around that corner pretty fast in the meander, digs a pool. It's eroding that bank. And then it comes into that run there, the crossover area, and it naturally wants to deposit that material right there as it slows down before it speeds up again through the next meander. And so we're really taking this idea about let water do the work. We're taking the hydrology of this system and understanding what's happening to decide where's the proper spot for a one rock dam. And it really takes advantage of those natural erosion and depositional patterns. Again, at the bottom here, we haven't really talked about this, but coming up, having a slight smile in your one rock dam instead of just flat, that makes it harder for water to sneak around each side. And so that's another important component that we've been trying to use. Next. So one rock dams, they trap a lot of sediment. This baby here is only 2 years old, and all of this sediment happened this last year. I was just in this spot this spring, and you can see we're affecting this channel through grade control, but now this channel is a lot less steep after we've trapped all this sediment. Now the next step is to have vegetation grow up through and stabilize this soil. And then we've really succeeded in implementing grade control on this particular reach. Next. I like to say there's some people who really know how to fit rocks together. And then there's some people who are really good at hauling rock, like packing rock to the site. So everybody has their own skills, but these structures are made to be fit together really nicely. So we like to have as the least amount of cracks as possible. Of course, we're not using bricks, we're using native rock. This one is particularly nicely fit together. And so structural integrity and functionality are both improved when we're fitting our rocks all one height, but fitting them together really tightly and nicely. So it's definitely not just throwing a pile of rocks in the creek or in the gully or in the drainage. It's a uniform built structure with principles that we should be adhering to. Next. Again, in this one rock dam, you can see some of the vegetation recruitment then behind it. Now that we've got water stacked up there periodically for a certain amount of time of the year, this is an ephemeral drainage. Now we've got some rush coming in there, some water loving stuff that really starts to hold that soil in place. And that's the effect that we really want to have. Next. We could talk a little bit more about, grazed pastures. We have learned that livestock and elk want to walk right next to our structures. And so we've extended them up into off the bank just a little bit. You can see this is a little bit oversized for the channel. It comes up both sides out of the channel. And that's to eliminate some of that trailing pressure potentially right next to a structure. But again, uniform surface, holding the water back. Vegetation is more robust on the back than on the front side. Next. So our last approach for restoration really of meadow systems is this idea of how to restore sheep flow. So we talked about that these wet meadows and mesic meadow areas really shouldn't have a channel. And a lot of them do have channels now. And so sometimes we can intervene and try to restore sheep flow back onto the meadow surface and get it out of that gullied system. Next. These are a few of the techniques that we use to restore sheep flow. These are all hand-built systems. The media luna in the upper left, the worm ditch, and a drift fence. And let's talk about each of these. Next. The media luna is a very fun structure. It's slightly more complex than it looks in that what it wants to do is it wants to take water from a channelized position, and we're talking about this lower one, the sheep flow spreader, tips up media luna here. It takes water and it spreads it out. And it's an effort to get it out of a channel and respread it on the adjacent, perhaps abandoned floodplain or meadow surface on each side. Next. The thing that's important about a media luna is that it's built on the contour. So that is the same elevation all the way across the top of the structure. So it's flat. So it's the same elevation. So what happens is water comes into it and spreads through the whole area. And so this is the one structure where we like to, if we have a laser level, we like to maybe shoot it all the way across, make sure it's flat. But being low tech restoration, we also use like a string with, just a little bubble level that you can get for like $2 at the hardware store. So these don't have to be complex ideas, or complex construction techniques, but it is important to realize and understand that the media luna wants to be built flat. So all one elevation across the top. Next. And this is what happens. This is a beautiful media luna that was built in Gunnison. And next, the water comes into it. Go ahead, next. Yep, water comes into it. And instead of going just straight down the channel again, because it's flat, it fills in behind that media luna and then soaks out all across the face of it. And so it really spreads that water again, redistributes it, tries to reestablish sheep flow across the meadow. The media luna. Excellent. Moving on to the worm ditch. Sometimes we put a filter dam in front of a worm ditch to get the water out, but mostly it's about the worm ditch. And so the worm ditch is about taking water out of a channel and trying to reestablish it as sheep flow across the meadow surface. Next. So for example, in this particular picture here, same site, you can see, maybe you can see that there's a gully that forms on the left-hand side here where the channel used to go. And instead of letting it drop right into that gully, we recognize this opportunity on the valley right side here where there's much more meadow that had been abandoned because it fell into this old road, this old gully that was coming up the valley bottom. And so we put in a little plug. We call that the filter dam. That's the rock fill and soil that we took from the ditch. We filled the original channel and let it out really flat, nothing more than 2% grade, probably less, 1% is better. Let it out and then respilled it reestablishing sheep flow on the right-hand side, and we were able to get a lot more wet meadow, putting that water to work again as sheep flow. Next. This picture is pretty good. You look in the valley bottom there, you can see the meadow. You also see a bunch of trailing. So this is between a couple stock tanks, you know, and cows going twice a day to get some water. They walk in the valley bottom, make this trail. And so we put up what we call a drift fence. And a drift fence is just a segment of fence out in the middle of nowhere. It's not attached to anything. But the drift fence is intended to counteract the effect of trailing in the valley bottom. So now with this fence here, elk, cows, whoever can no longer use this trail in the valley bottom. So they have to walk up the hill, go to one of the H braces and head for the stock tank that way. And so in effect, these drift fences are trying to restore sheep flow by preventing this channelization and trailing process. Next. And we found this technique to be particularly effective. You see in the lower left-hand corner, this is the new trail that's formed with animals heading for that H brace and trying to get around this fence as they go up and down the valley bottom. So instead of walking right through the middle of the meadow in the bottom, where water can channelize, jump in that trail and start to erode and de-water, make a gully down through this meadow, we've forced these animals over to the side where we don't really care if they make a trail over there because it isn't going to trap any water and erode our meadow. You see this rancher here, you know, they're good at building fence and they understand this technique. And this is something that's really taken off in a lot of, you know, just private ranches where the guys are like, hey, I can do this. And, you know, the effects have been amazing. So restoring sheep flow. Next. So again, to recap, really, these approaches are something we should be thinking about. So not necessarily like what structure goes here and what's it called. We should be really thinking about what does the structure do? And these are the three approaches that we advocate. Head cut control, that's a preservation technique. Grade control can be both. It can be restoration and preservation, or restoring sheep flow. You know, that's kind of a true restoration technique. So think about these approaches as you're looking at your system. Next. These are a few of the technical resources that we could recommend to look through and go through these ideas. The erosion control field guide from Sponholtz, put out by the Quivira Coalition, is super. You can get those online. We all got together and wrote this tech note in 2000. If you're interested in that type of thing, roads are a major effect, as we've learned, and so using water and installing proper drainage, that can be a great resource. Jeremy, let's talk a little bit more in some different systems now.
Right on. Thanks, Sean. I dropped a couple of the links to these resources in the chat, so feel free to bookmark those for later. And let's go to the next slide, please. So as promised, we're just going to go further down the watershed for a minute and talk about some of our perennial systems and the techniques there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Oops. Need to back up a couple. There we go. So when we look at our perennial systems, we're bouncing all over, Megan. As we look at our perennial systems, a lot of them look like this, right? They're just a really pretty irrigation ditch. Structurally starved. In other words, not a lot of roughness in the valley bottom there, vegetation or wood or anything else that would slow down flow. And so what we end up with is a very kind of fast conveyance system for getting water around the landscape, but not in particularly very healthy. Next. And as I mentioned before, this idea of stage 0, something before that channel ever formed, has really become part of our thought process more and more in the riverscape restoration world. And we've been asked to really reimagine what's possible. Take that concept of this beautifully meandering channel and back up a step and ask what would have happened if this was, spread out across the entire valley bottom. Next. And in many of our perennial systems across the country, and particularly in the Western US, beaver dam activity was one of those very pervasive things that provided structure in the way of water that would have spread it out across the floodplain more often. Another piece, especially in our forested systems, is wood accumulation. And so jams and dams and other things like that get in the way of flow, force it out on the floodplain more often. And sometimes these things work in tandem to really create that structural complexity that turns that highly efficient drainage ditch into a more functioning network of channels and floodplains. Next. And because we're in Utah and many of you are familiar already with Joe Wheaton's work in low-tech process-based restoration and probably taken some trainings, we're just mentioning this. There's whole efforts that we do to dive deeply into this approach and these techniques for perennial systems, but just for some awareness, know that we do have things like PALs and BDAs are the terminologies that we use to kind of mimic and promote the ecological processes of structure within perennial stream systems. And so we'll just go to the next slide and mention that there's lots of different recipes, a lot like the recipes that Sean just went through with different names, but they're just the variations of the same types of concept of taking what native materials we have around and maybe anchoring them in where we need to achieve some desired effect, whether that's ponding of water with our beaver dams or our just disrupting the flow and either slowing the flow or actually pushing water around in that channel and that incised system with our post-assisted log structures, we call them. So you can refer to the pocket guides and design manuals that have been published on this, but just know that there's a lot of different ways to kind of achieve those outcomes. Next. Don't lose sight of the ultimate goal. The structure is not the outcome. The structure is a way to promote riverscape function and health. And so sometimes we're just coming in to add in enough structure and roughness to get some of these things kick-started, the processes we want. Sometimes it takes multiple interventions for that to actually happen. In other cases like this photo here, this is from a workshop we did out in Montana on private lands piece that, Robert Griffin was so excited after our workshop, we'd come in and put in some of these beaver dam analogues. And within, I think like a week, beavers had moved back into this prairie system and actually stopped to set up shop. And so they need deep water. And if we can help kickstart that process with these beaver dam analogues, sometimes that's all they need to get a foothold and start doing their own work. And that's ultimately what we want. We want them to do the work, let the system do the work. So we're not constantly, trying to keep the patient on life support and going back in over and over and over again. We want it to sustain itself over time. Next. finally, I'll just point you to this website here, and we can try to put that in the chat if I can figure that out. This resource is excellent. We've invested with diverse partners. The state of Utah has been a huge partner in this, producing a design manual for those that want to dive really deep into this work. We've got a pocket guide similar to the Sponholz Zeedyk pocket guide that Sean was mentioning. And then we have a series of self-paced learning modules actually for free. So if you want to come back and do some self-paced learning and dive deeper on these techniques, you can do that through this website as well. I'd encourage you to check that out. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Eric and Megan.
So one of the questions is, why can't we just dump a pile of rocks or hay bales in a head cut? It seems like this would be quicker. This must come from the part of the state I grew up in. This sounds like a solution, except if we threw an old car in there, that would certainly work too.
Yeah, these were the Thacker technique questions. Yeah, I could take a swing at that, and certainly Sean's got the practical experience, but it's a logical question to ask when you start doing this. Like, haven't we been doing this? We've been putting in little rock speed bumps. Engineers do it all the time along the side of the road, and the key thing that I've learned or picked up on is we're thinking like water, right? And so we want to try to understand, oftentimes when it's dry out there, we're trying to understand, where's the water going to go? If I put this rock right here, is it going to flow over, around, underneath, blast off the top and blow out another area? You're trying to understand where that water is going to go so that you can encourage the healing processes we want to encourage. Could we get lucky by just dumping a pile of rocks or a hay bale? Perhaps, and occasionally it works. A lot of times when folks are new to this, you'll see them just kind of spread out some rocks and go like, it kind of looks like what Sean showed in the photos, right? Except when he drills in and he shows you like, okay, I hand place these rocks so they're tight against one another and everything flows smoothly. And the main difference is like, if you were just dumping a pile of rocks into a gully, like there's engineering standards for like how big the rocks need to be before they get picked up and rolled all over the place. But when you're hand placing rocks, kind of like, like masonry work, there's a lot more strength in the structure when the rocks are placed carefully together, so that we really don't need to worry as much about the rock size moving under different flow events when they're hand placed and designed to work together as one big structure, all like kind of simultaneously. So anyway, I'll chalk it up to like, you can either get lucky and hope your rocks don't roll away and erode, find another nick point and erode it, or you can take a little more time and care and finesse, as Sean says, and kind of understand, we need to patch this lip right here. And if this doesn't heal, we're not going to be successful. I don't know, Sean, do you got anything else to add to that?
I think that's correct. Yeah. A lot of times too, I've seen, just rocks piled in a head cut. And what happens is the water gets in behind that pile of rocks and just keeps eroding. And so we need to go back to the principles idea. Like, what are we trying to affect here? And it really is, with head cut control, it really is about that vegetation at the top of the head cut. And can we maintain and preserve those roots which actually hold the soil, which stops the head cut from happening? And so I think that's right. A little bit of finesse, a little extra step to go from a pile of rocks to a well-placed, thought out structure that's proven effective, is a really good step to trying to be successful with these techniques.
Awesome. Kind of along with that, one of the other questions is, you know, in those deeper gullies, can we just build the rock structures taller? Meaning, would that help accelerate that restoration rather than smaller ones that you might have to come back and rebuild in a few, you know, or build new ones in a few years? Can you
Yeah.
just go bigger right out of the gate?
Yeah. We always love that, right? As Americans, we're like, let's go big. Hit the easy button, put it in the microwave, get it done, hurry up. Why don't we just do this all at once? And we have been trying that in the past, you know, Gabion check dams, some of those features were like, just fill it up all at once. And there's a good record of that stuff failing over time. But what Bill would say is that we need to be modest with our approach. We want to let the water do the work for us. So being modest with your approach, so limiting the height of that initial grade control structure to not try and do it all at once is a key component of Bill's techniques. His techniques are like, be modest, let water work with you, let water do the work for you. If we provide a modest speed bump for the water to go over, it'll slow down, ease up and over, and continue going down valley, drops its sediment on the uphill side. If we try and go in there and put 2 foot or 3 foot, all of a sudden that water has a lot bigger job to go up and over that structure. And what happens typically is with all that extra hydraulic pressure, it just finds a way around the structure and washes out maybe one side or the other. And so thinking about a little bit of patience with these types of techniques and being modest, I think are key components.
Can I add to that, Sean?
You bet.
Yeah, and one of the key elements of these structures is the vegetation. If we make a big pile of rocks so that no vegetation can come through those rocks, or a big hay bale that we can't get vegetation coming through that, those rocks are going to move. The cement that keeps the rocks in place is going to be the vegetation, and that's what we want to promote is that veg component. I think that's super important.
Well said.
Excellent point.
Awesome. So just kind of for my own curiosity and following up with that, because I've had people ask me, so what's the difference between Zeedyks and BDAs, which we've talked about some of that, but kind of in the same vein of what you're talking about, sometimes BDAs are set up to fail, right? You know, whereas with the Zeedyks, you're attempting to not, you know, I don't know if I'm asking this right. Zeedyks, you're trying to stop that erosion, whereas sometimes BDAs are set up to encourage erosion. So can you, either Jeremy or Sean or somebody, kind of highlight the differences in kind of the basic function between those two and why we look at them differently?
Yeah, it's something I struggled with for a while, trying to, in my own head, decide where to do what. And it's a blurry line, as you saw some of the pictures where maybe we blend some concepts like that together. But here's how I would think about it, or I do now. Rock is really stabilizing, right? Like it's not designed to be moving around. In what we're trying to do, we're placing it to hold the soil together long enough that vegetation can get established. And it's kind of related to, you know, how often it gets wet, how often does it flood, how often do things rearrange. So like an ephemeral or intermittent system, you know, would take a long time to recover on its own with just those periodic 2 or 3 week flows each year. Whereas further down in a watershed, a main stem perennial system has flow all the time. It gets flooded every year, and some years really big. And so stuff's always rearranging down there. In fact, you could rearrange that table every year pretty fast. And so in that setting, you know, having some wood struck, like permanency isn't an idea there. We want impermanent, dynamic. If a BDA blows out, it becomes a wood jam in the middle of the stream further down. Whereas if we were to try to put really hard fortified rock structures, which we have and we do for a variety of other reasons, it's a different intent. And maybe take some of the dynamism out of perennial streams that they should actually have.
Cool, thanks, Jeremy. I know the legacy of nothing eroding is hard to kind of overcome sometimes. Now, that's one of the things that I learned from Joe early on was we need sediment, and sediment has to come from somewhere. So in some cases you do need that dynamic flow to create some of that sediment, etc. So
Yeah, one concept we've actually played around with is, combining these rock structures. When you're further down in that incision diagram where I showed you, you get down into a trench. Well, how do we create a new inset floodplain? Well, we have to blow the walls of that trench out. And you do that by maybe pointing, a PAL structure or something at a wall and harvesting that sediment. And then below there, you might have a one rock dam, something to capture it and build it back up. So they might work in tandem in that way, in that, in that type of a setting where you're further down in that incision situation.
I think it's been really good. It reminds me a lot of the way I think about grazing management. Now, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer to a lot of the problems. It's often constrained by logistics, what resources you have available. And it seems like, the BDAs and the Zeedyks are all kind of in that same vein. You just have to look at what's best for your situation currently. All right, so Megan, I think we're ready to move on.